I grew up in a village in the early 60s. And I think there were only 2 cars in that village. By the time we moved from that village in 1971, there were more than 2 cars, but you still didn't need more than 5 fingers to count how many. So you can imagine how a little boy would be fascinated with cars or trucks or buses or what have you passing along the road. And you could further imagine how thrilled a little boy would be about journeys. In fact, I was so fascinated with buses that I had made up my mind before I was age 8 that I wanted to be a bus driver when I grew up. Which probably explains why every time I become daunted as a pastor, I want to go sit behind the steering wheel of an 18-wheeler. I still look with awe on tractor trailers and semis as I drive along the roads, and every time I could look up to see who's driving, I'm further intrigued when it's a female driver. Journeys have always been, have mostly been exciting for me. And it goes back to my childhood when I didn't grow up like nearly all of us here in a home where there was some vehicle parked in the garage. I told my children that you're spoiled because you were born in cars and you don't know what it is to exercise and to walk and to appreciate the toughness of life, but that's another story. I recall being thrilled about what we called outings when the elementary school that was about 2 doors away from our home would provide an opportunity once a year for the kids to take a long trip to the city to visit bottling companies. The first time I went to was it a Pepsi or Coke? I can't remember, but one of those bottling companies. It was on one of those trips to see industry at work. And very often I'd miss those trips because my parents couldn't afford the $2 or whatever it was to get on the bus. And I was grieved to stand at my gate and watch the bus being loaded and everybody else going away. Journeys. I was aware of a call to ministry. Probably before age 15, but the earliest I could really place it is at age 15. And when I sensed this call to ministry, the pastorate was the last thing on my mind. I don't know if it is because at age 15 and still there was, my father bought a car the first time he owned a car, and the only time he owned a car, actually 2 years before he died in that car. And I was already in my 20s. So perhaps my sense of call could be explained by that, those variables. And so my idea of a call was that, hey, I was being called to an itinerant evangelistic work. I pictured myself on a plane and visiting all sorts of countries far away, maybe because I liked long journeys. But as I grew older, and all these years later, I have not been an itinerant evangelist. I have traveled to some places to preach the gospel. And the journey has not been all fun and games and all laughs and grins. There have been potholes along the way and valleys encountered. But I would not trade this journey that has resulted from responding, even as a boy, to the call of God for anything in the world. I'm far away from my family. It's not easy or cheap to get there, but I wouldn't trade responding to the call for anything. Because when I weigh, even if I did the crude thing of weighing the wonderful things against the not so wonderful things, the wonderful things still stand out. But it's more than just the sum total of the wonderful things. It's much more than that. It's the satisfaction of knowing that even in the bad times, one is pursuing a journey to which God has called one. Hence, I want to talk to you today about a rewarding journey. I have found the journey that has resulted from responding to God's call to be a very rewarding one, and I'm sure the journey isn't yet done. The joys aren't done. Maybe the sorrows aren't done either, but who cares? The reward isn't yet complete. Last week, when we began this series on God's call, we looked at a woman at the beginning of her journey, a rewarding journey, and we did hint in passing that Rahab, who we meet as a prostitute and who is described only in the Bible as a prostitute, we saw at the beginning of her call a couple of things that I want to recap for you. We saw for us the subtlety of embarking on God's call. We don't know when she was called, but we just see that she is. And a call may have crept up on you or is creeping up on you. You just don't know when. You just know that you're called at some point. Some of you will know when it's happening. Some of us will just know we're in the midst of it. And then we saw the complexity of exercising God's call. It's not always easy. It's not always black and white. It's very complex at times. So we have to be flexible and open. And then we saw the ability to embrace God's call, and we went through several things which I won't repeat today. But I did mention that we have evidence in scriptures about how rewarding this call was, or how rewarding the journey that resulted from the call was for Rahab. She ends up in Matthew chapter 1 in the genealogy, the lineage of Jesus, as a foreparent of the Lord Jesus Christ. What a reward. And our text today, which I will read in a moment, also gives us the beginning of a journey. And by the end of this message, I will tell you about the reward. But in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 9, we find our text, which I read now. Chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means." Quote, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," unquote. It's a very interesting reading you gave us, Rick. Look at that there. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. This is the beginning of Matthew's journey, which I put it to us is a rewarding journey that is the result of the call. And here, unlike Rahab last week, whose point of call we cannot find, we find the exact point and time of call of Matthew in this text. And he begins the journey, and it is going to be a rewarding journey. Why? He's called by the King of Kings. He's called by the Master. Wouldn't we like to find ourselves in the physical presence of Jesus Christ? For as we were reminded by Elder Kirkpatrick, the unseen undercover boss is always with us. But the thrill of experiencing something like what Matthew did is perhaps one of our desires. I hope it is. So I want to use this experience that we read of here in this text to further our thinking about call. For I've reminded you last week that to be alive is to be called. To have a name is to be called. For you are God's creatures. Whether you are in covenant with Him through faith in Jesus Christ or not, God has created you for a purpose, and you should be interested in discovering this purpose, and He is calling you to this purpose. If you are a human being, you are called. So, here are three things from this text, this call of Jesus upon Matthew, that I would want us to bear in mind. First, God's call on your life, or God's call on human lives, usually involves a disturbing redirection. God's call upon a human life usually involves a disturbing redirection. So when Jesus encounters Matthew, where is he? He is sitting at a booth, the tax collector's booth, for he was by profession a tax collector. And I had Adam read that passage about Zacchaeus, because what is true about Zacchaeus is also true about Matthew. But what Luke uses to describe Zacchaeus, Matthew doesn't use to describe himself in his gospel. And in Luke, you heard that Zacchaeus was very rich. And we know why, because tax collectors didn't only serve the Roman government, they served themselves. And nobody was counting. They were accountable to nobody but themselves and the Roman government, accountable to the government for the amount the government expected, and accountable to nobody else for the extra that they collected. They were devious men, and that is why Zacchaeus had the wherewithal to repay 10 times to anyone whom he had robbed. And you could be sure it was a lot of people. For a man to have the ability to pay back 10 times to any number of people whom he had robbed, having encountered Jesus changing his life, is not only a statement of the remarkable transformation, but it is a statement of the remarkable enrichment and resources that a tax collector would have. So that's true about Matthew as well. Matthew is found, as Jesus calls him, sitting at the tax collector's booth. What's the image you have there? First of all, he's sitting. You're sitting. You're very comfortable. And the posture of sitting is eclipsed in its comfort only by lying down. And I once heard a preacher say that usually when you hear somebody say that the Baptist church was full this morning, that there's enough room for everybody to lie down and go to sleep. That's a joke. But Matthew was sitting. It's a position of comfort with which I'm sure you won't argue. Next, he wasn't only sitting, but as a tax collector, I put it to you that he was also summing up. As he sat at that booth, what was he doing? He was collecting. And as he collected, he was counting off what was for the government, and the rest is for me. 1 for you, 20 for me. So that also is a position of comfort. He was counting, and you could be sure he wasn't counting what he lost. He was counting what he gained. A position of comfort. He was sitting, he was summing up, and I want to coin a phrase. I suggest he was also status quoing. For as a tax collector, it was a position to maintain. It was not a position to give up because of the enrichment, because he was untouchable. Never mind the despisement with which tax collectors were held by the people. The enrichment made the despisement sink into oblivion, if that's the mental makeup of the tax collector, which perhaps it was. So there was Matthew, in a position of comfort, sitting, summing up, status quoing, and of course the sum total of all of that is that he was successful. By man's standard, he was successful. Every one of these 4 images is an image of comfort. An image of comfort. And what does Jesus do when he comes walking by Matthew? He disturbs him. He disturbs him. Follow me. You can't follow me by dragging yourself sitting down still. You got to get up from that seated position. He disturbs him in his sitting. He disturbs him in his summing up. You can't count anymore. Perhaps if Jesus, I don't know if he did say to Matthew at some point, follow me and I'll make you counters of men. But, you know, he was disturbed from counting money. He was disturbed from being part of the status quo. For foxes have holes, birds have nests, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. You follow me, you're going to be in a minority. In the world you will have much tribulation. The world hated me, they'll hate you. It is a call that is a disturbing redirection. And often the call of God upon a human life is a call away from comfort. So I have a little warning for us. The warning is this. I have often heard, and it's not that it is untrue, I've often heard people say that you will know what God is calling you to when you have a comfort level with it. It is not always necessarily so. Sometimes the sign of the call is disturbance. Deep, deep, deep disturbance. Sometimes for you, sometimes for somebody else. I have a relative who was in his teens. He experienced a sense of call to the ministry. And his father said to him, "Over my dead body." And I had a chat with that person's father about that episode. And the father said, "My concern was that I know how hard the ministry is. I know how absolutely unthankful the ministry is, and I did not want that for my son." It was a bad call in response to a very clear sign of call, the disturbance. So it is not always that you will find a comfort level as the sign of God's call to something in particular. Sometimes it will be searing discomfort. It will be a call away from sitting down in Ur of the Chaldees when you're 75 years old and called to go and you're not even given the destination and you're just told, "Get up and move." It will be a call away from sitting down at a tax collector's booth, earning a living from a nice, comfortable profession. It will be a call away from that. It will be a call away from what you know, fishing for fish, to going after something that is even more difficult, fishing for men. So that's the first thing I want us to appreciate this morning. The call of God upon a human life is often a call away from comfort. It was the situation with Abraham. It was the situation with Paul, comfortable as a Pharisee of Pharisees, heading up to Damascus to do what he was successful at, and he was called away from that with which he was comfortable. This church is familiar with the writings and with the videos of a certain American pastor. And one or two of our own people have met him in the flesh or have sat in a place where he has ministered in the flesh. That man founded a church in the southern part of California with 30 people. And not many years later, it grew to thousands of people. Became a successful writer. And his videos are viral. And towards the end of 2010, when ministry was moving like a well-oiled machine, success on every hand, the man had a sense of discomfort that he was not where God wanted him to be. Success all around. A world-renowned preacher. His style just disarming and comfortable for anybody who sees it, and we've seen some of his videos. The man leaves that church, not the ministry, he leaves that church. No money worries there, no people worries, you know what I mean, because the place was always packed and full. No headaches. And he goes away to the land where his parents hailed from on a spiritual journey. And he returns to California, and he is now in San Francisco, just leading a couple of house groups and by evening and going out by day on the streets telling people about the love of Jesus. A successful pastor. And it all began, and he thinks it is very rewarding, and it all began with a sense of discomfort. Look, I can move on. When God's call comes upon a human being, it usually involves a disturbing redirection. Second, God's call upon a human life will involve deliberate response. I think when we look at Matthew's response to Jesus' call, we see a textbook response. So as Jesus comes in verse 9, he sees Matthew and he says, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. That's the end of it. That's the end of it. So you want to know what a textbook response to a call is when you become aware of it? First of all, do it swiftly. Do it swiftly. The moment you are aware of a call, do it swiftly. I was 15 when I first was aware of a call. I was still in high school. And by age 19 in my final year in high school, I had already figured out that since my favorite subject in which I got all A's was principles of accounts, I was going to college to become an accountant. A tax collector. For the same reasons these guys went to be tax collectors, I grew up poor. And I wanted to earn money. And I wanted to buy a house for my mother and all of that. And in February of my final year in high school, when I attended what was called a Keswick Convention, a Deeper Life Bible Conference, at which the late Dr. Stephen Alford preached, I heard the word, and I didn't hear a voice, but I knew God was speaking to me, and the message was, when I call you today, it is not for tomorrow. It is for today. And that is why I headed straight from high school to college/seminary. So I'm useless to corporate America, they will say, for anything except to preach the gospel. And I don't really care about that. When God's call is, when you're aware of that call, the desired response must be swiftness. Do it swiftly. Secondly, do it speechlessly. Jesus walks, he sees Matthew, he says, "Follow me," and Matthew got up and followed him. We don't hear a word from Matthew. There's so much discussion, so much argument, so many questions, so much devil's advocate, so much complaining, so much praying about it, so many words when God calls. Now, I know that we have to clarify, and it's allowable to use words to clarify, but I think you get the picture that we use too many words to ward off that call. For what it's worth, if you're aware of God's call upon your life, do it speechlessly. As little talk as possible, because talk could get in the way. So God calls Abraham. Not Abraham, Moses. I can't do it. I can't talk. Well, he used the classic excuse. I am speechless, so I can't do it. God says, "No, sir. I'll send your brother." Do it speechlessly. Do it swiftly. Do it speechlessly, and do it sincerely. How do we see sincerity with Matthew? Well, we know because he stayed with Jesus for those 3 years, and he stayed with the apostles beyond the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. Sincerity, he stayed with it. Let me tell you the last thing that I pull out of this text for you. In this matter of call, God's call upon a human being usually involves a disturbing redirection. You may be comfortable where you are thinking that that's just where God wants you to be. He might disturb you. Be open to it. It will involve a deliberate response. Do it swiftly, do it speechlessly, do it sincerely, but just say yes. And the third from this example of Matthew, God's call upon your life will involve deepening relationships. Deepening relationships. God's call upon your life is a call, first of all, away from seclusion. Like I said earlier on, I grew up in the 60s. I became a Christian in the 60s, baptized in the last year of the 60s, was born into a church family, born into a Baptist home, Baptist family. My whole life I've been in church. I've backslidden in church without ceasing attending. So I know I can sense when people are in church but still backsliding. And I alert leadership about it when I can, and hope leadership will take that ball and run and hear that I'm not just spouting hot air. That's another sermon. But growing up in the 60s and becoming a Christian in the 70s or becoming a growing Christian in the 70s and learning evangelism in the 70s, guess what? I learned it bad. Because back then, the message and the mantra was, when you become a Christian, you put away all your unchristian friends. You don't know. And we use scripture to back it up. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 19, if I'm correct. And that was wrong, dead wrong. And I think we know better today. There were noble intentions behind it because, noble intentions from a poor presupposition. A poor presupposition. And the presupposition was that Christians who hang out with non-Christians will find themselves being tugged down and weighed down and pulled away by the non-Christians. I know that happens, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen to everybody. For if Jesus himself said, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world, it seems to me that a Christian can maintain meaningful relationships with non-Christians as long as the Christian knows that he is, as the Old Testament says, she is meant to be a light to the Gentiles, or as the New Testament says, we are to be witnesses to them. So, whatever that call is, it is a call, as Matthew demonstrates, to deepening relationships. It's a call away from seclusion. So Matthew maintained, as you see in the text, he maintained relationships with his old friends. So shortly after his encounter with Jesus, there's a party in his own house, and his old friends are there. Because demonstrated by the old thinking that is going on. So we know it is his old friends. Many tax collectors, and both times in the NIV I read here, sinners is in inverted commas. I think the point that could be made before we move on here is simply this. That if you find that you are a Christian in seclusion, you got to break out of that. Now, I'm not talking about personality here. I mean, we all have different kinds of personalities. But when salvation comes to even an introvert, he or she must be so open to the transforming power of Jesus that they don't become a recluse. So that's the warning. Whatever the call is upon your life, it is going to demand more of you. It's going to pull you out of your shell. And you should not use the excuse that I am an introvert, because the word conversion applies to that as well. Second, it's a call away from selfishness. These deepening relationships to which God's call involves is a call away from seclusion, is a call away from selfishness. Matthew shared his home. He shared his resources. He opened his home to many tax collectors and sinners, as ornery as they were. It's a call away from selfishness, a call to hospitality, a call to releasing your resources. And you heard Elder Patrick say earlier on, in his house group, one of the things that they talked about was this sense of, well, what do we find too hard to let go of? Time. You might share your car, you might lend your car, you might even open your house, but time is your personally guarded thing. No one can take that from me. It's my time. Well, look, whatever it is, God's call is going to involve your coming face to face with your dearest treasures, the dearest idol that I know, whate'er that idol be. Help me to tear it from thy throne and worship only thee, the hymn writer says. And then these deepening relationships which are involved in God's call upon a human life. It's a call away from selfishness. It's a call away from seclusion. It's a call away from selfishness. But it's also a call away from spiritual one-manship or one-womanship. The kind of people who think that they can do it alone and they can do everything alone and they don't need anybody's help. And every time you offer the help, they don't want it. They don't need it. They're getting by fine. That's one aspect of it. This call is a call to partnership. It's riddled. The New Testament is riddled with evidence of it. But what is the evidence in Matthew? Notice what happens. Matthew invites his friends to his house. And he also invites Jesus. And backs off and leaves it to Jesus to deal with them. What a wonderful picture. That takes the weight off of our shoulders in this thing called witnessing. And that's another thing that I learned in the 70s, that we are the ones to speak them into the kingdom. Yes, we have to speak, but we often forgot that, hey, this is just about bringing Jesus into the presence of people because of the indwelling Christ in us. We mingle with them. That's how they will come into contact with him. And we leave it to him to witness. Of course, he's not there physically like he was in Matthew's, in this text, but he's there in our spirit and he's there in our partnership. So the lesson is that as you remain open to what God is calling you to be and to do, bear in mind that you're not called to do it alone. You're called to partner with Jesus Christ. And by extension in the New Testament, you're called to partner with one another. We're a community. And another thing that I don't remember if it was taught specifically, but it certainly was what I learned, whether I learned it wrong or I heard wrong or whatever. There was this sense that I had to witness and I had to win somebody rather than we together. We together. So that really struck me. That Matthew invites all his friends, all his rogue friends, and Jesus as well. And he lets Jesus do the talking. Don't you see it? He lets Jesus do the talking. Because he knows that once friends like these gather, there'll be conversations that Jesus could have some impact on, and so said, so done. So I say to us today that accepting God's call leads to a rewarding journey. And the reward, of course, in Matthew, in this episode, is Matthew's gospel. The reward of Matthew's response to the call of Jesus upon his life and journeying through that call is, among other things, Matthew's gospel. It's a reward, and it's our reward. And there's some things in Matthew's gospel, if Matthew hadn't written his gospel, we would never know about. We never know about the slaughter of the innocents. Only Matthew of the 4 gospel writers records that. We'd never know of the visit of the so-called 3 wise men, or the Magi, or the Magi, or the Magi, however you pronounce it. And it wasn't 3 according to the text, by the way. We wouldn't know about that. Only Matthew, of all 4 gospel writers, records that. We wouldn't know about the 10 foolish virgins, though we could probably do without that. Not true. But there's some things that Matthew alone writes about. We wouldn't know that the Romans concocted a story to blame the apostles for taking Jesus' body out of the tomb to explain away the resurrection, except Matthew wrote his gospel. None of the other writers record that. They're gems that we have, and many a person has entered the kingdom on the declaration of these stories that Matthew recorded. It's a reward. And you might have already picked up that, wait a minute, he's talking about reward, but it's not Matthew's reward. Matthew's gospel is our reward. Aha, you got it right. You got it right. Because here's this point. That we usually think about rewards and benefits in terms of ourselves. What is there in it for me? What benefit can I derive? What reward for me? And we limit our sense and understanding of rewards and benefits to ourselves and our families and our friends. But this text today challenges us to go broader. Matthew's reward for following Jesus, yes, is an education with Jesus for 3 years. Yes, it's an eternity with Jesus. Yes, it's the honor of being one of the apostles who built the church. Yes, but all of that was hard work. But the shining reward is something that didn't benefit him. It benefits us, the gospel. The gospel according to St. Matthew. And therefore I ask us, what reward would there be if you swiftly, speedily, speechlessly, and sincerely accepted the call of God upon your life, whatever that call may be? What reward would there be for somebody else rather than yourself? That's the question that I end this sermon with this afternoon.